So with industrial revolutions now, right, we're coming from the concept, coming from the concept of the different types of revolutions that we were looking at, the different types of radical military revolutions that we were looking at, and I'm assuming some people would have done Unit One before Unit Two, but personally for me, I did Unit Two before Unit One. So for the persons who did Unit One before, you don't understand the concept that for centuries, for thousands of years, one of the major things that contributed to societies across the globe would have been agricultural potential, right? And what we're seeing here is a major shift, right, within the world order as it relates to the systems of production, right? So you guys have heard that term already within sociology or Caribbean studies. The systems of production are changing. Now we're not really looking at the death or overturning of monarchies or anything like that now, but looking at how the human species as themselves revolutionized the way in which they could produce something or how much they could produce. We're looking at what happens with mass production, right? And how we got here. Alright? So for the industrial revolutions, now we have to understand the context of pre-industrial society in the pretext of industrial society in Britain. Right? So we're looking at the British society first. So we've known specifically that we're looking at an agrarian society. So societies before this time were primarily agrarian. Right? Before I move on, before I even move any further, in which century did we have the industrial revolution occurring? When did it start? Which century?
So the 17th century.
17th century, lovely. Close to the middle to the end of the 17th century, we had agrarian revolutions occurring, right? So the agrarian society and population growth was a big thing in Britain at the time, right? So Britain was primarily an agrarian society, right? Right, so majority of the population was really engaged in agricultural work, and these agricultural practices were a traditional and inefficient, right, ways of really producing, producing on a whole, right. So usually we have in the society large scattered regions of small scale subsistence farming across the countryside. And Britain experienced significant booms in its population due to the improvements of living standards and nutrition and healthcare, right, with the agrarian revolutions, right? So the agrarian revolution would have led to the increase of different types of farming tools, right, which would increase, and the advent of crop rotation, right, which would have increased the amount of food that we could have produced, and it would actually create a boom and create a surplus, right, in the labor force, particularly in rural areas, right? So by the time of industrialization, many of these persons who populated heavily, who were in the heavily populated rural areas would have moved towards cities, and this is what we call urbanization. We're gonna look at that, right? So there were some amount of acts now, the enclosure movements and technological innovation. The enclosure acts are something that you must mention when speaking about the industrialization of Britain. Right, the period saw the emergence of technological innovations, however, in agriculture, textiles, and transportation. Right, inventions such as the spinning jenny and the water frame and seed drill, right, improved productivity and laid the foundation of industrial manufacturing. Right, so what we're looking at now, specifically with the textiles, right, and the invention of the different agricultural machines, right, led for capitalists, right, or led for persons who had enough money to buy enough or to produce enough of these machines, right? So what they could do now is use these machines in wider areas. We have now what's happening within the British government at the time, what we call enclosure movements. Enclosure movements were underway, consolidating small scattered plots of land into larger, more efficient farms through fencing and privatization. So now we're looking at the privatization of land. This is where capitalism begins. The shift from a feudal society to a capitalist society, right? We now have the privatization, and not remember before, we had some privatization by persons called nobility. And then within revolutions, we have nationalization, giving back this land to the people. But now we're seeing now, if you have enough money, you can capture the land from the people and now privatize it and call it now privately owned land. So we have the privatization of these large lands, right? To what it basically did was take all the land, generally from these subsistent farmers, buying up all the land from subsistent farmers, right, and creating no large commercial farming, right? Enclosures distributed traditional rural communities, or disrupted rather, traditional rural communities and led to displacement of small farmers, contributing to social unrest and rural urban migration, right? So now these farmers were robbed of their land. They couldn't really do anything about it. Some of them were paid off, right? Now they had no land to actually make a living for themselves, right? All the huge corporations, right, who had these machines now took over the land and privatized it. So what's happening here now? We have commercial and colonial expansion and the rise of capitalism. So Britain's commercial and colonial expansion provided access to new markets and resources and wealth, and trade networks and colonial ventures brought back new raw materials, goods, and capital from overseas, stimulating economic growth and capital accumulation. Right? This fueled the transition between feudalism and capitalism, right? So that transition was underway, characterized by the emergence of capitalist entrepreneurs, wage labor, and market driven economies. So, the enclosure, colonialism, and commercial expansion created favorable conditions for the growth of capitalism and the accumulation of wealth. These are really the causes of the industrial revolution, right? So we're seeing that majorly what's happening is that colonialism, capitalism, and slavery were the three main drivers for the creation of enough capital, right, for industrial revolution to occur, right? So the agrarian revolution and urbanization now. We know that the agricultural revolution or agrarian revolution is. We know that there's an introduction of agricultural innovations. So we learn about the water frame and the spinning jenny and the seed drill by Jethro Tull and all these inventors that were creating new ways to really increase the yield, right? So they were adapting new technologies and new different types of farming techniques to increase yield, right? Right. So this increased agricultural productivity. So there were significant increases in agricultural productivity and food output, and that led to more population growth. Now, what happened now? When you have such a large population, capitalists don't call it a population, they call it a workforce. Now we have a large workforce brewing within Britain, right, as the population skyrockets, right? And this workforce will have contributed to some amount of industrialization as well. So we have urbanization and migration. So rural urban migration, right, or what we call urbanization, would have been caused by the transformation of agricultural societies, right? So know that agricultural societies changed generally from the subsistence farming to now commercial farming. They had to now find, or the farmers or the peasants would now have to find other ways of making a living other than just living out there in the countryside farm, right? Farming what you can eat and eating and living with your family. No, your land is gone. How will you actually live and survive, right? The answer to this was actually going to the cities, working for wage. This is wage labor, right? To buy the food that you could have just sat in the countryside and farmed yourself, right? So now we have the movement of these persons from the countryside to towns and cities to search for employment, for better opportunities, right? So there's a rise of industrial centers as well. Urbanization created concentrated industrial centers such as Manchester, Birmingham, and Leeds, where factories, mills, and workshops proliferated, driving economic growth and urban development, right? So there are large industrial centers now, right, that created factories for the processing of the surplus goods that they have within Britain. And now the persons who they took the land from have to go and work within the factories of the same corporations, right, to actually make a wage or make a living to actually, eat. All right? So that's what's happening. So the drivers of early industrialization now, let's look at these factors, and these are mainly resources that we will look at. Okay? Is everything fine so far before we move into the drivers of early industrialization? Everything fine with agrarian economies and societies?
Yes, sir.
All right, lovely. So one of the main resources now, coal would have been one of the main resources for industrialization, right? So coal was fairly abundant on the British Isles, right? So there's abundant energy source. So coal was an abundant and easily accessible energy source found in large deposits across Britain and the Indian subcontinent. So I'm not sure if we've looked at British Raj, right? Or what we now call today as India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh. All of that area was owned by Britain under the rulership of Her Majesty Queen Victoria, who was the queen of all the British Isles and India, right? India and Britain itself had large deposits of coal, right? And this widespread availability to the British, right, would have provided affordable power sources for their industrial processes. So when you speak about the fuel for the steam engines now, with the invention of the steam engine, coal was very essential for powering these steam engines, and it drove machinery in factories and mines and transportation systems. The invention and widespread use of steam engines revolutionized industry by increasing efficiency and productivity. And coal itself drove, it's kind of a circular process here, because coal was used in machines, right, to expand the mining industry, and the mining industry expanded because they wanted to find more coal. So it's kind of a circular process here. But the demand for coal spurred the growth of the mining industry, creating jobs and stimulating economic development in coal-rich regions, right? So coal mines became key centers of industrial activity, contributing to urbanization and population growth. All right. Iron was also a very important resource, right? So it was a versatile building material. Iron was a versatile metal used in various industries, including construction, machinery, transportation, and infrastructure, and it served as a foundation for industrialization, right? Providing the raw material, right, for manufacturing machines, tools, and equipment. So notice that iron was used to make the equipment, coal was used to run the equipment, right? So a key component of manufacturing would have been iron, right? So producing steel and other durable metals were used to create railways and bridges and ships as well as buildings, right? And the development of the steel production techniques such as the Bessemer process and other types of chemical processes would have revolutionized industrial manufacturing and construction, right? And we also have it for support of infrastructure projects, right? The availability of iron within Britain and her colonies facilitated the construction of critical infrastructure projects like railways, canals, and bridges, right? So this is now where we see that we don't have to use wooden bridges now, but we're seeing the production, right, of metal bridges, large bridges that could actually support larger amounts of persons crossing at the same time. We saw the advent of railroads that will connect large vast of British colonial territory together, especially within India. We have the railroad system booming within India. We have railroads booming across Egypt, right, which was colonial Britain at the time, Nigeria and the Cape, right, to South Africa. Um, well, South Africa would have been given to the Dutch at a later date. So let's speak about Nigeria. Those African colonies as well, right? They have a large spur in railway infrastructure, right? So we start to see the ease of transportation using these industrial resources. The significance for industrialization now, right? So it was a catalyst for industrial growth, right? Coal, right? We're looking at the significance of all of them, right? So generally how coal and iron contributed. So the abundance of coal and iron provided necessary foundation for industrialization, fueling economic growth, technological innovation, and urbanization. That is important, right? So remember, iron and steel and derivatives of iron were used to really create the machinery that we saw here, the inventions, right? And coal was used as the primary factor to really run these inventions, right? There was a competitive advantage. Britain's access to coal and iron resources gave it significant competitive advantages in global economy, allowing it to dominate industries such as textiles, iron and steel production, and shipbuilding. Right? Another thing, one of the other reasons, it's not in the PowerPoint, so hopefully I can get my point across, that Britain was surprisingly stable compared to the other British nations at this time. France was going through a revolution, right? Other empires, other nations within Europe specifically, were looking towards France, in fear of the revolution. Others were going towards war. Others had to deal with their own citizens, right? Britain was primarily stable. So the political stability allowed them to focus on industrialization. So remember that that could be a solid point as well, right? Colonial expansion actually helped with industrialization as well, as in the British Raj, which is now India, right? The exploitation, right, of coal and iron resources served interests in British colonialism, providing cheap raw materials for British industries, generating revenue and revenue for colonial administration, right? So you know it takes a lot of money to run the colonies. So when you could actually create these large industries and monopolize on them, you make enough money to actually run the colonies, right? The legacy of industrialization as well, the legacy of coal and iron mining persists in regions such as the British Midlands and Northern England, where industrial landscapes and heritage sites bear witness to British industrial past. So British industrialization still has some amount of fervor within Britain till this day, right? So we have that. Now we have to look at industrialization and its contribution to the Atlantic world, right? Or the contribution of the Atlantic world, rather, on industrialization. So raw materials and slave labor, along with the plantocracies, would have been huge. So the Atlantic world we know would have provided Britain with access to vast array of raw materials, including cotton for textile, sugar, tobacco, rum, timber, and precious resources and precious metals from the Atlantic world would have been connected to trade networks headed towards Europe, right? So these raw materials will provided foundation for industrial growth specifically. Slavery played an integral role or a central role in the production of lucrative cash crops such as sugar, tobacco, and cotton in the Caribbean colonies and the American South. Right? Enslaved Africans provided cheap and abundant labor. Well, cheap labor. Is it cheap or is it free? Right? Abundant labor for plantation agriculture. All right, really working under brutal conditions to cultivate harvest crops to export to Europe. Right? So you see, all these crops that the enslaved were really reaping at the time, right? They have contributed to the lucrative benefit of Britain, right? For them to actually now use this money to spend on industrialization, right? So the profits generated from slave trade and plantation economies flowed back to Britain, enriching my merchants, planters, and investors, and fueling economic growth and capital accumulation. Right? So that's what we have there. That's one of the contributions of the Atlantic world. Urban development and infrastructure now, right? So the wealth accumulated from the Atlantic trade and plantation economies financed the development of port cities within industrial towns in Britain, right? So many of these slave towns, right, are what we call towns that were built on the backs of slaves. There have been areas like Liverpool and Bristol and Glasgow, right? Grew wealthy. They grew wealthy on the involvement of the slave trade and processing of raw materials imported from colonies, right? So many of those influential cities within Britain, right, would have grown so influential, right, because of their wealth that they ascertained from the involvement in the slave trade and raw materials and processing of raw materials that they got from the slave trade, right? We also have the increase of urban infrastructure, including docks, warehouses, factories, and transportation networks, right? Those were built using profits derived from Atlantic trade, laying the groundwork for industrialization again. So these are some of the contributions of the Atlantic world, right? The capital accumulation, right? So I won't spend too long on this slide really. What it's really about is looking at the fact that the Atlantic trade and colonial exploitation really increased the amount of money, revenue for the British, right? So the British could have used these revenues now, right, to actually pour capital into creating factories and machines, right, and stuff like that, right? So basically the money from the trade, right, and colonies fueled industrialization within Britain, right? So they fueled enterprises, well, industrial enterprises such as textile mills, ironworks, and coal mines, driving the expansion of industrial production and development of new technologies, right? So that would be that, the contribution of the Atlantic world, right? And we could look at the major inventions. So having the textile machinery, right? You would have the pour loom, the spinning jenny. These machines would have allowed for the creation, right, of clothing and fabric at much faster paces. We had the steam engine pioneered by James Watt, right? One of it was literally probably the most transformative invention of the industrial era, right? So it allowed for a power source of factories, mines, and transportation, replacing humans and animal labor with mechanical power, right? We also had stuff like the telegraph made by Samuel Morse, as in Morse code, right? Samuel Morse, who revolutionized long distance communication. So now you don't have to go on a donkey back, right, or a horseback, right, to travel across large swaths of Britain. You could just use a telegraph, right, and information would have been sent over large distances, right, much quicker. So it facilitated commerce, diplomacy, and news dissemination, and reduced the time and cost for information exchange. Right? We also have the railroad, right? The railroad, introduced in the early 19th century, transformed transportation by providing faster, cheaper, and more reliable means of moving goods and people. Right? So it connected distant regions by facilitating movement of raw materials, finished products, and spurred economic development and urbanization along these routes. So the railways really played a crucial role in military logistics, colonization, and expansion of empires. Right? So that is that there. So the impact on the Caribbean and Latin America now, the impact of British colonialism, not colonialism, industrialization rather, on the Caribbean and Latin America now. Well, the economic restructuring, right? The rise of British industrialization rather, shifted the economic focus of the Caribbean and Latin America from agricultural to export-oriented production. Plantation economies in the Caribbean based on sugar and coffee and other cash crops became increasingly integrated into global markets and supplying new materials for British industries. Right, and we also have the demand of raw materials fueled the expansion of plantation agriculture, right, leading to the intensification of slave labor and the growth of monoculture, right? So where they just only grow one lucrative crop, right? So these things, even monoculture, it would have led to the draining of the soil in some countries, right? So which led to long-lasting social and environmental impacts. So some of the social and environmental impacts that we're facing today as countries within the Caribbean would have been from this industrial era, right? And them using the land, right, to its very best to actually send back all profits to Britain, right? But the dependency and underdevelopment. So British industrialization deepened economic dependency on the colonies and Latin America. So now, since go ahead,
Sir, by chance, is this offering going to be available in the WhatsApp group?
I could send it, yeah. So it could be a help, right?
By chance, could you send it in perhaps after or during this presentation so I can just like follow along because I have something else
Okay,
to do at
okay.
this moment.
That's
That's
fine.
all. Thank you very much,
No
sir.
problem. Right, so British industrialization. Now we know that we've created a dependency situation within the colonies and within other Latin American territories as well. Right, so we know the colonies were not industrialized at the time, rather. Right, they were mostly being exploited. Right, and all the goods were sent back to Britain. Right. So what happened here is that since Britain was really the only one benefiting from industrialization, all British products, right, would have been sent back to her colonies, right, and other areas within the Atlantic world. So the colonies themselves built a dependency on British goods, right? So even till this day, these impacts, sometimes people think that history, right, is really far off, but history is really staring at us, right? It's looking at us. It's in your face at the moment. Because now, when we look at contemporary Caribbean societies, right, we are dependent on foreign goods from more industrialized and first world countries because of this underdevelopment set on by British industrialization, right? And it has been so much ingrained for centuries through British industrialization that we objectively believe, right? Not objectively, subjectively believe, right, that honestly foreign products are better than local products, right? Because we're so dependent on foreign products, and this stems from British industrialization. So the unequal exchange between colonies and the metropole, combined with exploitative exploitative labor systems such as slavery and indentured servitude contributed to economic stagnation and social inequalities in the colonies. So the colonies now focused only on agrarian societies. They didn't really industrialize at all, right? The British government really didn't put a lot of industrialized approaches within her colonies. It allowed her colonies to be purely agrarian, so extract raw materials and resources to send back to Britain. So while the colonies stood there within their own agrarian society, their economies stagnated, right? And then now, what the colonies had to do was take all the products coming from Britain because they could not produce it themselves, right? So that's what was happening here. So the dependency there. We have social dislocation and displacement. So the expansion of British industrialization led to some amount of social issues, right? So social displacement in the Caribbean and Latin America as traditional agrarian societies were transformed by commercial and agricultural urbanization. The introduction of capitalist modes of production disrupted traditional systems or traditional systems or economies and communal land tenure systems, right? Displacing indigenous peoples and rural communities, right? So what we're basically saying now, we have to clear land, we have to remove these people, right? We have to create room, right, for industrial expansion, right? So it had some negative effects on industrial and rural, well, not industrial, but indigenous peoples and rural communities. So the demand for labor in plantation economies resulted in the forced migration of enslaved Africans and indentured laborers from Africa, Asia, and Europe, shaping the demographic composition of the region, right? So after a while, enslaved labor was really just about, right, making some money, right, for the Europeans, right? But with Britain now, when they're going through this entire industrialization process now, the drive for enslaved Africans and the drive for indentured laborers really hang in the balance of its economy, right, going through this expansion stage with industrialization, right? So, slave labor, indentureship fueled British industrialization, right? We have political and cultural hegemonies being produced as well, right? As British industrialization reinforced political and cultural hegemony across the Caribbean and Latin America, colonial authorities and European settlers imposed their values, institutions, and ideologies on indigenous and enslaved populations, right? Because they had the power in the society, right? So they imbue their political identities and their cultural identities and institutions onto these people, right? Because it is through the institutions which the British, right, conduct colonial, imperialist procedures, right? So the spread of British colonialism and imperialism facilitated the imposition of colonial rule and extraction of resources and suppression of indigenous resistance and rebellion, right? So what we're doing is now we're creating political structures that are familiar to Britain, so they can control the countries and the colonies through those political structures, and I've seen throughout neo-colonialism in some African states today, right? And we can also see, right, that we're imposing British culture onto the people in the Caribbean and Latin America, right, to basically result in cultural erasure and reducing the chances of rebellion and resistance. So British industrialization also contributed to widespread Western cultural norms of consumerism and language, displacing indigenous cultures and traditions, right? So now what they're basically doing is that the only way we can continue to control these people is to make them more like us. So if we're gonna be selling these goods to these people, they need to speak our language. If we're gonna be sending these goods to these people, they need to have the same capitalist mindset of consumerism, of wanting more and more and more. Let these people learn consumerism so they can always want our products, right? We're looking at these stuff, right? And in order for us to change the ideologies and culture of these people, right, we need to displace their cultures and traditions. We need to remove the cultures and traditions, right, and non-materialistic natures of indigenous peoples. Let them build materialism so we can benefit from giving them our products, right? Let us remove West African identities and make the enslaved African more like us so they can indulge in our products, right? After a while of making them more like us, what we can see here is something similar to what Eric Williams, a Trinidadian economic historian, was saying about his decline thesis, saying that British industrialization played a central role, right, in actually abolishing slavery, right? We're saying now that the profits of the Caribbean slavery played a central role in British industrialization. The slave trade and plantation economies generated substantial wealth for Britain, which was reinvested in industrial enterprises, infrastructure, and technological innovation, right? But what's happening here now? The success of British industrialization now, right? What we're basically saying is that that was because of the enslaved Africans and labor intensive production. That was because of the indentured laborers, right, producing the commodities from Caribbean economies, right? And slavery was not a backward or inefficient system, but profitable and integral component to capitalism, right? Slavery was a precursor to capitalism. It is what brought about capitalist sentiments in this specific way with the contributions of the Atlantic world to British industrialization. After a while, capitalist systems and British industrialization became way more profitable than slavery. So why sit here and suppress revolts? Why sit here and suppress all the sentiments of the enslaved? Why not just release them, then pour our goods into emancipated societies so we can continue economic slavery via our industrialization? That is the question. And that is one of the things that Eric Williams was speaking about. He was hinting to the fact that slavery had now, right, not become more, it had become less lucrative, right? So what we could do is control the systems of production via political systems and then feed our products to the former colonies to keep our hegemony, right? To keep our place on the world stage. This is what was happening here, right? So those are the impacts of the British industrialization on the Caribbean there. All right. So hopefully there